Hello, everyone. We're just waiting a few minutes to start our webinar today. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Refugees International webinar, Unseen Victims, Displacement and Organized Crime in Mexico. I'm pleased to introduce Sarnata Reynolds, our Senior Advisor for Human Rights, who will report out on her recent field mission to Mexico, where upwards to more than 2 million people have been displaced by the work of violent criminal groups. My name is Kendra Davis, and I'm the Vice President for Philanthropy here. And before we officially start the presentation and I hand it over to Sarnata, I wanted to share the format for our webinar today. Sarnata will share her presentation, and afterwards we'll open the floor to any questions you may have. By doing that, you could just enter your question right on the chat box, which is to the left-hand side of your screen. Feel free to just type those questions in. And then at the end of the webinar, there'll also be a survey that you're welcome to take to let us know how we did. We're always looking for feedback on how we can improve our presentation, so feel free to do that as well. Once again, we're very excited to be sharing our work in Mexico. It is a hidden humanitarian crisis that we've been very interested in exploring. And I'm going to now hand it over to Sarnata Reynolds. Sarnata.
Thank you, Kendra. This is Sarnata Reynolds, as Kendra said, and I was the primary researcher on our work when we went to Mexico in May and June of this year. So just in terms of my background, I am an attorney by education. I spent 8 years in San Francisco litigating asylum and deportation defense cases and did a lot of work on Mexico and Central America. And then I've been in Washington, D.C. for 7 years, also doing research and advocacy on displacement crises around the world. So Mexico was our most, Myanmar was my most recent. Mexico was my first this year, and it was the first time that RI went to Mexico in our history since 1979. Now, probably sounds a little strange that an organization called Refugees International would go to Mexico, but there are a few reasons. First, we knew that the violence there was epidemic, and of course, endemic, and of course, I'm sure everyone has heard about the 43 students that have gone missing, who may well be dead in Guerrero state of Mexico, and that's a terrible episode that is unfortunately not an anomaly. There are masses of people being murdered and disappeared in Mexico. And we knew from our experience in other countries that if that much violence was taking place there had to be a lot of displacement around the country. But no one was talking about it, and we knew very little about it. So we thought we should go. We also thought it was important because Mexico is a country that has capacity. It's one of the biggest economies in the world. And so we thought if Mexico can figure out ways to respond well to displaced in the country, then that's something that could be transferred to other countries. So today we're going to talk about 3 things: the proliferation of violence and organized crime in Mexico, the consequences for Mexico's ordinary people, and then what can be done about it. I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation right now, so if there's anyone who can't see this, my speaking should be independent enough of it that it's not a problem for you. But if it is, just let me know. You can send a little note or just go ahead and speak and let us know. So this is a map of Mexico, obviously, and the darkened areas are the areas where the most displacement as a result of organized criminal groups is taking place. And as you can see, it's the entire northern border of Mexico, the southern border of the United States. But it's also most of the states in Mexico. We went to 5 places. We went to Baja California, to Sinaloa, to Aguascalientes, and that is a small state in the middle. You'll see the red dot. That's not producing displaced people right now, but that is a place where displaced people are going because it's stable. Mexico City and Veracruz. And when we went, we met with 75 internally displaced people, 5 government agencies, NGOs, civil society organizations, academics, and we briefed the Mexican embassy in Washington, D.C. here, both before the trip so that they know what we're doing, and also after we returned so that we could talk to them, of course, about what we had found, what our recommendations are, and how we would like to see the government moving forward. So we're talking about two Mexicos today, and of course Mexico is so much more than this. It's a country of incredible beaches and geology, and also history, food. It's an incredible country, but we're going to focus on the Mexico that is open for business and is doing well, and under the current president has really strived to build the economy. But then we're also going to talk about the flip side of that, which is a Mexico that has expensive organized crime, where there is massive corruption at the local level of police and public officials, and at the state level, and to some extent, unfortunately, at the federal level. But in terms of corruption, I just want to be clear that this isn't all about bad actors in government or the police. There are a lot of mayors and police officers under death threat if they don't go along with the cartels or with organized criminal groups in their area, and so they've done it under coercion. So some of it's for the benefit of the individual, some of it is just literally under coercion. There's been lots of mayors and lots of police killed for fighting the cartels. So this is a map that shows in the shaded, the darker, the more red the state, the more violence that has taken place there in 2013. And as you absorb some of these statistics on crime, I want to tell you a little bit about the consequences for Mexican people. First, like I said, we don't know exactly how many internally displaced there are, because the Mexican government is yet to acknowledge that this is happening, that people are being displaced as a result of organized criminal groups. And but what we do know is, based on some studies that have been done, is that in Ciudad Juarez there was 230,000 people displaced just from that city. Based on another study that was done, they identified up to 1.6 million people displaced. And there was a Mexican newspaper that came out with an article about a month ago that said they think it's 2 million people displaced in Mexico as a result of organized crime. So it's a massive amount of people. We still don't know where they are learning. The consequences for people who are the victims or the survivors of kidnappings and death threats, who go on the run to get away from them, are of course a complete lack of security, both where they left. Of course, they were under death threat where they left, and then when they arrive in the city or the town or the rural community that they're living in, they often still are subject to security threats. In fact, there was one family we met when we were in Mexico who, after arriving in a city, had 3 of their sons murdered. And others were living in a state of terrible insecurity. But also, kids lose access to education, and people lose access to health care. And it's so important for this population because they've been through so much. Everyone we met, except one family, had at least one murder in the family, had kidnappings in their family, and it was recent. And so they're in survival mode, and they're in a state of uncertainty, and they really need psychosocial care, but it's not there for them. They also lose access to housing, to shelter. So we met people in Sinaloa who were basically squatting in outside of Culiacan, that's actually the center of one of the Sinaloa cartel, squatting on land, who didn't know when they'd have to leave, who'd been there already for 2 years. It was 3 generations of a family, and grandparents who were in their 80s. Had never lived anywhere but their ranches, and were living without any electricity, without running water, without any knowledge of what was going to happen next. And of course, they don't have access to justice, although many of them are pursuing it, and they don't know when they're going to return or if they're ever going to return. So this next slide is a slide that shows people that we actually met in Mexico. So as you can see, it's men and women. It's boys and girls, older people and younger people. There were ranchers and business, entrepreneurs, kids in school, mothers. It runs across the gamut, and it's people can be people who are people on the run from organized criminal groups come from every socioeconomic group, but there are some indicators we see, and the consequences for different communities is oftentimes based on where they come from and why they were targeted. So now with that, I wanted to tell you about one of the families that we met. This is Maria and Juan Carlos, and we met them in Mexico City. They are from Michoacan. And their story is emblematic of so many because they're members of the middle class who were targeted by the cartels because they were doing well. And unfortunately, this is the case for so many people in Mexico because by doing well, they become a target because cartels or local gangs decide, well, these are people we can get money from. These are people that we might be able to get resources from. So this family was Maria has Juan Carlos was one of her children. She had 9, and the boys in the 90s went up to the United States for work because there was no work for them in Michoacan. But the intention was always to come back to Mexico to start a business together and to build it as a family. Well, and that's what they did. Every summer, every few months, they would go up and they'd work in the fields. They'd work in construction. They would work at meat packing plants, whatever they could do to get work and put some money together. They'd do. They'd come back down and they'd open a bakery, or they'd open a meat shop, or they'd open a clothes store. And if it didn't work out, which it didn't, go back up. And in 2008, though, it did work out. They started a jewelry store, a jewelry business, and it did very well. And so all the sons were able to come home to Mexico and work together. But because in 2008 they did very well, that's when their trouble started as well in Michoacan. So one day, two of Juan Carlos's brothers and Maria's sons were out on a delivery with some of their workers, with 3 other workers, and they were ambushed by a cartel, and they were disappeared, and they haven't been seen since. Juan Carlos decided that he would be the one in the family to pursue, to find out what happened, because they didn't know, and because he did that put him in more danger. But the family continued to run their business and to go to other states to sell, and in 2011 it happened again. 2 more of their brothers and a son-in-law were also killed. Now Maria she's a grandmother, 26 children. 5 of those kids now don't have dads. They haven't heard from their brothers since 2011, and they don't know where they are. But Juan Carlos and his mom decided they were going to do everything they could to find out. And because they did that, they were put under death threat. In 2014, they were escorted out of Michoacan by the police because they were not safely there. The family is scattered across Mexico, and some are actually in the United States now. They've received protection. They don't have the business anymore. They obviously they don't see each other as a family in the way that they did before, which this family was a family who wanted to be together. Now they're all scattered. And they're now, Maria and Juan Carlos are in Mexico City they've opened up a case with the Federal Attorney General's office, and they're trying to get justice for their family. Another population of people who we met and who also are under terrible siege by the cartels are people who live in rural communities. So as I said, we went to Sinaloa, which is a state that had the Sinaloa cartel, which was the biggest cartel in the world, was the biggest cartel in the world, is there. And in 2012, that cartel was in conflict for territory with another cartel. And so whole swaths of ranches and communities were basically driven out. We were told by the people we met that the people would arrive at the ranches and they'd say, join us or you die. And so and people were killed, and cattle were killed, and houses were burned down. And so they just grabbed everything they could, put it into cars, put it onto horses, whatever they could do, and they brought it with them down from the Sierra Madre down into Culiacan and surrounding areas. The picture you're looking at here is a little girl we met, of a family we met that are they're squatting, and they're basically living on a garbage dump, as you can see. This little girl and others in her family should be in school. They're 2 years in to this displacement, but they're not in school because they don't have birth certificates. These ranching families that we met have been ranching for generations. They've never needed birth certificates because everything they needed to do was in and around their ranches. And so now that they've come down, they need birth certificates to go to school, and they're trying to get them. But even 2 years in, having talked to the government, they still haven't received them. So these little kids, and some of them went from age probably to 5 all the way up to 18, aren't in school. They've missed their school. But the cartels are also taking over territory because they can use it for illegal mining. They can use it for wood extraction. They can obviously take over and start growing poppies and marijuana. And they also, one of the business models, if you will, for the cartels now is to seize the territory and then, I'm putting in quotes, and tax everyone on it. So small avocado farmers are taxed, and limes and lemon farmers are taxed. That the smugglers who are going through are taxed. Everyone has to pay to the cartel to stay where they are and to remain safely. And so this is true of many states in Mexico, many rural areas where they're not under the control of the government anymore. They're under control of the cartels. And the other type of displacement that we saw when we were in Mexico, I wanted to talk about, was something that really looks like, well, it really is armed conflict taking place in different parts of Mexico. So, for instance, in Michoacan, the state has basically been under the control of a cartel called Knights Templar. And in 2012 and 2013, many of the citizens of that state decided enough. The government hadn't helped them. They were sick of being targeted and having people killed and disappeared and kidnapped for ransom. And they took up arms themselves and they went village by village to go after the Knights Templar. And they actually did quite well. In 2013, the government joined them at the end of 2013, but at that point it became a real armed conflict. There were tanks on the streets, there were heavy armory, and people were caught in the crossfire, just like they'd be caught in the crossfire in any country where armed conflict is taking place. And so they fled north. And we actually went to Baja California, to Tijuana, because we knew we would meet people there from Michoacan because of what had been taking place. Again, this was based on our own experience and expertise in other countries. And that's what we found. The people we met there are stuck. They had sought protection in the United States because they have a fear of persecution in Mexico, but they hadn't been granted. And they couldn't go home to Michoacan. So there's a whole community of people now, and we don't know, again, we think it's thousands of people who are stuck. They can't go home, they can't go north, and they need to now to somehow recreate their lives there. So they need livelihood opportunities. They need they need to get the kids into school. And in the meantime, Michoacan, Guerrero, and other states as well are not stable, and they can't return home. So obviously, Refugees International is working on this issue because the Mexican government has the obligation to ensure that its people are not displaced. But if they are displaced, it needs to respond to that, which it's not doing now. It needs to make sure people are able to stay in security, that they have access to housing, and education, and health care, all the basic things that anyone, anywhere should have access to. So we're working on this issue for that reason. But there's also a real economic imperative here. Mexico, has been moving and successfully has been moving into a period of transition where its economy is growing and where it's aggressively soliciting the business of multinational corporations and others. But if its workforce, if its people are on the run, if they're coming to work but their heads are concentrating on their family member that's been kidnapped or been killed or because they're under death threat themselves, they won't do well. And it won't be stable for anyone. So Mexico needs to get this right for that reason too. So finally, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our recommendations and how we proceeded to go about how we're trying to make them real. So when we got back, we wrote a report and identified a few different things we thought the Mexican government and U.S. and the UN could do. So first we said, acknowledge this is happening in Mexico. Identify and count the displaced. So this isn't always easy. We know that there are people in many different states. And many people are actually trying to stay under the radar because they're afraid of being found. But they can do this, and there are organizations around the world that have the expertise to help them. So we want them to do that. And then when they figure out where people are and what they need to respond to that. So Mexico already has a law in place. It's called the Victims Law, and it was signed by President Peña Nieto in 2013. And that law came about after many years of pressure from Mexican and international groups to provide protection to people who'd been victims of organized crime and local gangs, both migrant victims and Mexican victims. And for a person who is a victim, it says you have rights, and these rights are exactly what we're asking for: to shelter, to reparations, to go back home if it's safe. So we want them to use that law. Right now they're writing regulations. They haven't been written yet, but we want that, when it's written, to get implemented and to get fully funded. Mexico needs to improve its birth and civil registration system. It will probably surprise you to hear that in 2012, 30% of Mexicans had not been registered with the government. That means they basically don't exist. They don't exist on paper. Now, it's mostly in rural areas and with indigenous populations, and one of them being, of course, the communities I told you about in the Sierra Madre. But and the government knows it needs to get better, but it needs to do it quickly because more and more people are on the run. And then finally, we want to see training of local and federal police and the military on how to identify what an internally displaced person is, how to identify them, how to start helping them helping them in their place of refuge or in their place of displacement. And then we are also asking the U.S. government, when Mexicans come to the border seeking protection, that they have the opportunity to see an asylum officer. Now, this is actually totally consistent with international law. It's also consistent with U.S. law. But the reality is that Mexicans, when they go to the border to seek protection, are turned around. We're not saying that every Mexican person should be admitted and provided with protection, but if a Mexican person, just like a person from any other country in the world, seeks protection and is qualified for asylum or for some other protection in the U.S., the person should be admitted. And then we're asking that the United Nations Refugee Agency also engage in this issue. So the Refugee Agency is in Mexico. It works with refugees in Mexico, and you'll probably be surprised to hear that the largest population of refugees in Mexico is from Eastern Africa, from a country called Eritrea. And it also works with unaccompanied children, many of whom, of course, are coming up through Central America right now. But they have the expertise to work with the internally displaced and to help the government of Mexico to find out where people are and to assess what they need. They need to do that. So we're engaging with them and encouraging and really doing everything we can to get UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, to engage in this issue. Finally, I would be remiss if I were not to talk about some successes that we've had so far. I'm happy to say that shortly after the report was released in early July, I was invited to go to a conference in Bogota in Colombia to present our findings and recommendations in the report. Now, the conference was put together in preparation for a big event that's happening in December to commemorate the Cartagena. And that is an agreement between the governments of the Americas that refugees and internally displaced people and migrants have rights and need protection. So in December, they're going to put forward a new 10-year plan of action. Our presentation was part of that. And I'm happy to say that as a result, our civil society consultations and our consultations at a higher level with the UN, the displacement in Mexico will be part of that agenda. It will be discussed, and it will be included in this plan of action moving forward. Also, I wanted to let you know that on November 27th, some of the people that Refugees International met when we were in Mexico, who we were able to get to know and take pictures of, will be included in a book that's coming out and will be featured at the Museum for the Memory and Tolerance Museum in Mexico City. This book is on internal displacement. We've been invited, and we're able to include photos of of people that we've met from all over the world, including Mexico. And then finally, if any of you are in Chicago or live in Chicago or are going to be in Chicago on January 22nd, I'd like to invite you to the Chicago Circle, where the former ambassador to the United States from Mexico, Arturo Saracan, will be our guest speaker, our keynote speaker, and will also discussing this issue, its importance, and what can be done about it. So with that, I will open this up for questions. I know some of you may have sent questions may have written questions. Others of you may want to ask a question. So let's just go ahead and open it up.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, we can go ahead and close for today. So if there's anyone there who's just unmuting, I'll give you another second. Okay, well, with that, I want to thank everyone so much for being on for participating in the webinar today. This is really important work to Refugees International. We do hope to go back to Mexico next year. And so I hope you'll continue to follow us and to support us in this work. And please feel free to follow up with me if there is a question that you'd like to ask and you didn't want to ask it in a bigger group. You can reach me at my email. It's Sarnata, SARNATA @refugiesinternational.org. Thank you so much.